Before we begin, let me ask you something most people never think about. If the power went out tonight and stayed off for 6 months, not 6 hours, not 6 days, but half a year, how would you eat, stay warm, treat illness, and protect your family? No refrigerator, no phone, no GPS, no credit cards, no emergency alerts. Just you, your knowledge, and whatever is within walking distance. That was not a hypothetical problem for our grandparents. During wars, depressions, blackouts, sieges, and economic collapses, electricity was often the first thing to disappear and the last thing to return. Yet millions survived, not because they were tougher than we are today, but because they knew systems that worked without plugs, batteries, or screens. Those systems were passed down quietly, practiced daily, and forgotten just as quietly once modern convenience took over. In this guide, we are going to walk through 9 survival methods that kept people alive through famine, bombing campaigns, winters without heat, and total infrastructure collapse. These are not theories. These are documented practices used in Europe during World War II, in rural America during the Great Depression, in occupied cities, and in isolated farming communities for centuries. And every one of them can still be used today. When fuel and power disappeared, families had to find new ways to create heat and light. When electricity vanished, well, darkness became dangerous, and cold, it could be downright deadly. Folks survived by mastering the art of layered heat and carefully controlled fire. Homes were sealed up tight with cloth, paper, and even old newspapers to block out the drafts. At night, windows were covered with quilts. Entire families would sleep together in one room, just to share body heat and keep warm. Brick stoves, clay heaters, and those small iron ranges were kept going with twigs, scrap wood, and compressed paper bricks made from soaked newspaper and sawdust. For light, people turned to oil lamps, tallow candles, and homemade wicks floating in animal fat. One simple method, was to fill a shallow dish with cooking grease and thread a cotton string through a hole punched in a bit of tin. That little setup would burn slowly and safely for hours on end. Today, this old knowledge still matters. You can keep oil lamps on hand, learn to make emergency candles, insulate your sleeping areas, and, understand how to build a safe microheating zone inside just one room, instead of trying to heat up the whole house. So, how was food preserved without refrigerators or freezers, you might wonder? Well, before electric refrigeration, every household was, in its own way, a preservation facility. Meat was often salted, smoked, or packed in rendered fat. Vegetables, on the other hand, were fermented in crocks. Milk, that became cheese, and cabbage turned into sauerkraut. Apples were stored in cool cellars, layered in straw to keep them fresh. And eggs? Those were preserved in lime water for months on end. One common wartime method involved packing cooked meat into ceramic jars, covering it with melted lard, sealing it tight, and then storing it underground. When the jars were reopened, sometimes months later, the meat was still edible. Anyone today can relearn these skills. Just a single fermentation crock, a smoker barrel, and some basic salt supplies can well turn a backyard into a food security system that works even without power. So, how was water made safe without modern filters? Well, when water systems failed, disease always seemed to follow. Survivors had to learn to purify water using simple tools, you see. Boiling, that was the primary method, really. Charcoal and sand filters were often built in wooden barrels. Folks would collect rainwater from roofs into covered barrels, and wells were kept safe with sealed lids. Sometimes silver coins were placed in storage containers to slow bacterial growth, just to be on the safe side. You know, a basic gravity filter made from layered gravel, sand and charcoal can still be built today in an emergency. And really, knowing how to locate clean runoff and protect stored water is just as important as knowing how to store food. So, how did people stay fed? Through backyard farming and wild foods, that's how. Victory gardens, well, they weren't hobbies at all. They were survival engines, plain and simple. Every patch of soil produced beans, potatoes, carrots and greens, you see. Fruit trees were guarded like gold, no exaggeration. Chickens and rabbits were raised quietly in sheds. And wild plants like dandelion, lambs, quarters and purslane, they filled the nutritional gaps. Well, a practical approach today means learning three things, really. How to grow calorie crops, how to preserve seeds, and how to identify safe wild plants in your region. You know, clothing and gear were repaired instead of replaced. When factories were destroyed and imports vanished, nothing was disposable anymore. Shoes were resoled with scrap rubber, jackets were patched again and again, blankets were rewoven, buttons were carved from wood, and honestly, needles were treasured. Learning basic sewing, leather patching, and fabric reinforcement today means your gear lasts years instead of months. How communities protected themselves without modern policing. In blackout cities, neighbours organised watches. Rotating patrols monitored streets. Whistles and bells were used for alarms. Windows were blacked out at night. Security depended on trust and coordination, not technology. You know, modern communities can still apply this by building real relationships and, well, communication plans before crises happen. Back then, when hospitals were unreachable, folks had to figure out how illness was treated. Home medicine, really, kept people alive. Garlic was used as an antibiotic. And honey, well, it sealed wounds. Willow bark eased pain, herbal teas treated infections, and, you know, cleanliness became absolutely critical. You know, learning basic first aid and herbal medicine today provides a medical safety net when systems fail. So, here's something to think about. How information travelled without phones or internet. News moved by word of mouth, notice boards and handwritten bulletins. Couriers carried messages between towns, and folks listened carefully to shortwave radios powered by hand cranks. You know, maintaining paper maps, printed contacts and emergency radios really preserves communication when networks collapse. Why discipline and routine? Well, they mattered more than supplies. The strongest survival tool, honestly, was structure. Families kept strict schedules. Meals were rationed. Wood was counted. Water was measured. Waste was minimized. Panic was avoided through routine. Survival is not about hoarding. It's about managing what you have with calm precision. You know. Every system described here has been tested under real collapse, just so you're aware. None rely on corporations, satellites, or digital infrastructure. They rely on skill, memory, and discipline. You do not need to live off-grid to benefit from this knowledge. You only need to practice it before you need it. Learn one method, then another, then another. That is how resilience is built. If you found this guide valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who cares about self-reliance, and help keep this forgotten knowledge alive for the next generation.